So I have 3 points to make quickly before I hand over. One, the term jagah in Hindi and Urdu. Jagah means, if any of you know or have friends in speaking those languages, means a place. Now the curious thing about the term jagah is that in Hindi etymology and Hindi linguists, they consider the etymology of this term to go back to the Persian language. And in Urdu dictionaries and among Urdu linguists, they consider this a borrowed term from Hindi. And it's ironic that the term for place has a kind of placelessness in its origin, right? But then something more important has to come up here, which is not just the placelessness of place, but rather the worldliness of place. Because one of the terms that is attributed to Jagah is Jagat, a term in Sanskrit. The Jagat means the world, and it's actually a term that's used in Bengali, Assamese, various languages, the world. And so this relationship between the place and the world is one point I want to make. The second point actually relates to a pendulum that was made in 1851 in France by Léon Foucault. This is not Michel Foucault, the critical theorist. This is a physicist in 1851 who created this pendulum in a Parisian Pantheon building. And this pendulum, once it's swung, what it does is it kind of maps the Earth's rotational axis. And it was doing this because of the 67-meter long thread that it was suspended on. So when it is hung, the world is actually rotating. And this was the first experiment that physically and directly proved that the Earth not only revolves around the sun, but it also rotates on an axis while it's revolving around the sun. And what's kind of confounded physicists and philosophers for 2 centuries now, since this discovery was made, is that how can an object, a pendulum inside a room, know something about the entire universe, right? And this is a philosophical as much as a literal problem that they've kind of been looking at. And why I'm making this point as my second point is because I don't want to leave you with this romantic image that every place belongs to the world, but rather a more pivotal problem about the relationship between what place or what is universal and what is particular. How do you draw the line? The radius of a place is not a pre-given. A place can be measured based on its connection with the entire universe to a very small circumference, that this is where you belong and nowhere else do you belong, right? Where does that pendulum belong? To the entire universe or to that one room where it's just swinging, right? Third point and last point, I won't take much of your time, is actually going to another Foucault, and this time the critical theorist Foucault, Michel Foucault. And he, for a long time, spent much of his thinking on questions of power and regimes of power, systems of governance, systems that designate who is, like basically how bodies are to be managed, right? Biopower and things like that. And this is something that we have to think about in terms of places too. Regimes of power that construct a place. And this construction of a place cannot be measured merely by real estate development, that who builds houses, who builds parks and things like that, but rather it's a symbolic project, kind of like the way even Antonia mentioned about the conceptual glue, the relationship between objects, spaces, bodies, and people, right, and communities. So the one regime, the powerful authoritarian regime, usually tries to designate a place against multiple other claims made over a place. And here the term that Antonia was using about contestations becomes very important, that a place is always a site of contestations. It is a site of multiple claims that are made and contested over and cannot be defined by just one terminology. At this present moment in the 21st century, these claims are happening on 2 different ends of the spectrum, yeah? One spectrum is the archaeological, based on excavation, and therefore also extraction, that this place belongs to me because there's a temple underneath this place, or there's a grave underneath this place, and that's why my ancestry belongs here, right? So there's an archaeological kind of dimension to the claiming of a place, and then on the other hand, there's a projection happening in the claiming of a place, which is kind of based on well, projections, but also augmentations, like AR, augmented reality, right? What is the future of this place going to look like? Let's speculate and let's project through holograms and all kinds of things what this place is going to look like in the near future. Let's create dummies, models, maquettes, right? So we're on the spectrum between the archaeological and the augmentational, right? And these two are actually at this very moment not on two different ends of the spectrum, but they actually meet very closely. And why I wanted to bring this up is because I think in METASITU's practice, we see some of these processes coinciding, the archaeological and the augmentative. And it's not just METASITU. I find a lot of interesting artists actually bringing these two ends of the spectrum together. And therefore, the complementary and the extractive, the complementary that you spoke about, Sumantro, of adding on, but also the extracting, when they start happening together, what do they produce? Well, number one, they produce all kinds of contestations. Now let's start looking at those contestations. And this then is, to make my last point, regarding interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity that we were talking about, that perhaps we have to start thinking very seriously about another emergence that we're in the middle of, which is anti-disciplinarity. Because this augmentative, this complementary approach is nicely co-opted into, oh, we can all do this together. But finally, when the specialists are called, they come and do exactly the way things are supposed to be done. And so what do artists and a lot of interesting creative thinkers and writers and all of these people do? They're actually being unruly towards disciplines, right? And not necessarily being happily multidisciplinary. And I'm saying this well aware that my organization and institution where I'm affiliated, Ishara Art Foundation, thrives and celebrates multidisciplinarity. But we also know that there's something very important to recognize in a certain kind of unruliness, undisciplining, anti-disciplinarity that we might have to look very seriously at in relation to the practices that surround us, right? And on that note, it gives me great pleasure to introduce an itinerant artist collective, or well, I shouldn't even call them artists because there's so many things. METASITU, a collective that explores the way we relate to territory across time and disciplines for a queerer tomorrow. Their practice is centered around non-hierarchical, symbiotic pedagogies that take the form of urbanism residencies, architectural interventions, intentional communities, self-publishing, real estate experiments, and videos. The work is largely focused on shrinking cities in eastern Ukraine and the Russian Far East, mainly through, well, one of the ongoing projects, the Degrowth Institute, and that's what we're going to be listening to today. But just to add their presence in this conference today, they were the artists in residence at Al Sarkal Avenue in 2019, which also culminated into a commission that happened right across in the yard. In what you see as the green patch of land in that little garden was their extraordinary project, which I suppose we're going to hear about. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
In July 2015, we met for the first time with the chief master planner of Mariupol, an industrial harbor town in Donbass. It's in southwestern Ukraine. Mariupol is a shrinking city. Since 1991, an average of 10 people have been leaving the city every single day, largely due to the paced closure of the steel factory, which was once one of the largest in the Soviet Union, occupying a tremendous footprint still on the city today. Another reason why people were leaving are the very high toxic levels of pollution that are resulting from the poor water, from the poor management of industrial waste. She sat behind an impressive desk, large enough to be a queen-size bed, with a colossal map of the metropolitan area of the city hanging behind her. It was color-coded, indicating new projects and zones where the city would expand in the coming years. Despite of decades of population loss, Mariupol still aspire to grow larger. If we come here in 2050, what will the city look like? We asked her. Well, I hope you find a very busy harbor with several skyscrapers, malls, and many gardens. Oh, something like Dubai? We asked her as we pointed to the tourism poster hanging on the opposite wall with the image of Burj Al Arab over the slogan, "Definitely Dubai." Yes, yes, something like that. The void between her ambition and the data we had been studying was abysmal. But we felt it was not so much due to her naivety or lack of understanding of the current situation, but rather because of the core essence of her job, master planning. You see, the logic of master planning is implicit in capitalist rhetoric. Starting from a tabula rasa, the city accumulates resources, territories, and people, expanding infinitely. Dubai had become, in her head and that of many others, a benchmark model for development, one that depended on growth, the urban success story, stereotype ad infinitum, after which to model Mariupol's future. Her job had largely been transformed from territorial planning to actively attracting new people and convincing others to stay. There was a clear route to follow, one that consisted on taming wild lands, injecting concrete foundations into the ground, and building more. It is we, an architect and a landscape architect, how we had been taught at school. But what would other urban futures would look like that did not have growth at their core? In other words, how could we master plan for degrowth? Different, mostly post-industrial shrinking urban centers around the world have tried a variety of ways to deal with their ebbing populations, from dramatically denying their shrinking conditions, to incentives to plan to recover population numbers, to smart decline tactics that claim to embrace degrowth, where they largely consisted on demolishing entire neighborhoods that, whereas they might have been empty of people at the time of the demolition, they remained filled with memories, and their destruction left entire communities that had once lived there feeling disenfranchised, that their childhood home had been violently razed to the ground. We're also struggling adapting some of the degrowth literature to urbanism and master planning. A lot of the degrowth language, at least in the context we were operating with, had been forged in Western Europe, in affluent areas where degrowth was in many ways a choice, like empty nester parents who decide to downscale to a smaller house in the countryside now that their children have all moved away and they have retired. But in the case of Mariupol and many other post-industrial centers, this was not a choice, but the undertow of global flows of capital, where population flows follow trade and landscapes are traded. Unlike growth-based master planning, where you start with a tabula rasa, or rather the perception of a tabula rasa, for no landscape is ever just nothing, when planning for degrowth, one is facing a territory layered with histories, meanings, and politics. No one solution fits all. There were many other Mariupols, not just in Ukraine, but around the world. But they were all different in different ways. This was a set of conditions that marked the beginning of the Degrowth Institute. By institutionalizing our practice, we wanted to deinstitutionalize territorial decision-making. We wanted to co-create tools with different groups of urban activists in different shrinking cities across Donbass, the Russian Far East, and Eastern Germany that would help us navigate the ocean of other vectors we meant by degrowth. Degrowth, commonly misunderstood as reverting growth, stopping development or demolition, we understood it as any transformation that did not have growth at their core or goal. It is a fluid definition, a definition that we're constantly adjusting, debating about, and reshaping, because we have not been trained to think of alternatives. And 6 years on, this still feels like very new territory. We're still traversing multitudes. One of the outcomes of the Degrowth Institute was the Degrowth Manual, which was created as a firecracker publication. It was designed as a series of activities and questions that were designed to ignite conversations among different actors who lived in shrinking cities towards non-growth futures. Conceived as a bilingual, Russian and English, self-guided and self-contained horizontal workshop to be done individually or preferably collectively, it was designed as an open source to be easily downloadable by everyone. The Degrowth Manual is also metamorphosical in nature, as every edition is adapted based on the feedback received from previous iterations. As one goes through the manual, there is a simultaneous process of growth, as the pages collect information, memories, and ideas from the participants, and shrinkage, as the pages are cut off to perform different activities. This seemingly oxymoronic situation and duality of collection and dematerialization is one that we came across at different stages in different forms throughout our work at the Degrowth Institute. One of the sections is the Degrowth Tarot. Offers a deck of specially designed tarot cards to be cut out to fortune tell an alternative degrowth future, allowing us to start wishful thinking outside the tentacles of growth, or at least to attempt to. In the workshops we hosted, we always partner up with local organizations and invited different stakeholders who were paid for their participations as part of the ephemeral research group we created in every town for 2 to 3 days. At the end of the workshops, participants would trade filled out Degrowth Manual for blank ones. The former being part of the Degrowth archive, the latter becoming a tool to utilize again in another setting with other people to design other non-extractive urban futures.
City building is an extractive process, and contemporary economic thought is an extractive process. Climate precarity, economic crisis, resource scarcity are reality, and the alarms that our increasingly urban lives cannot be built just on the processes that are extractive. How can we begin unlearning to extract, and where do we begin to detract? One of the spatial typologies that embody transformational degrowth are ruins and the process of reunification. It diverts a space from its intended course of action. A ruin can represent various narratives, such as degradation, heritage, or memory, to name a few. It can be intricately linked to the ideas of preservation and restoration of material evidence of memory. Ruins to be cared about and ruins to be left to ruin. In the capitalist thought, though, it represents a failure, a future that could but did not happen. Perhaps something that could explain the general consensus among us spatial practitioners to regenerate, demolish, or preserve ruins, to transform them out of the state of the ruin. We propose to think about ruins as potentialities, as futures that could happen. The practice of building ruins as pavilions or follies was not unknown to landscapers during the Romantic movement. They were associated with romanticizing the antique heritage, or what was left over of that, and exoticizing the foreign artifacts and cultural practices enabled by colonial expansions and trade routes. Follies introduced exotic, reinterpretation and displacement of different contexts, importing often phony Eastern-looking architecture and aesthetic resulting in ornamental garden pavilions, or more contemporary mini Paris constructed in China, or the countless copies of Venices around the world. However, follies also embodied a form of patronage back in the days. During the Irish potato famine, artisans and craftsmen were actually commissioned to build these unusable pieces of architecture in order to alleviate poverty. The ruins' ability to project different narratives and alternatives to the future became the starting point in order to return the former building and territory of Nadi al-Quds back to what it used to be. The definitive question became, but to return it back to what and to when? The former building of Nadi, which is the green patch of the grass that we see in front of concrete, it's along with the construction and development of Dubai, of Al Circle Avenue, it had undergone tremendous transformations. From arid landscape to industrial zone, from marble cutting facility to warehouse, with co-working spaces and space for public art. And this is only counting human scale timelines. For the Commission, we decided to partly demolish the building and transform it into a deliberate ruin, a temporary folly. The task we had set for ourselves presented us with the following questions. What does it mean to make a ruin? How do we unbuild? What does the process of deliberate ruinification entail? And what timelines will be representing in this ruin folly? Reclaiming nature for human-built environment in the name of economic, industrial, human progress is a process that we feel fairly comfortable with. But we find it difficult to reconcile when it comes to unbuilding, as it challenges the instinct of growth and the logic of capital. Oftentimes, when a building is taken down, it leaves connotations of erasure, loss, and violence. We began the reunification process by excavating and uncovering the ground, removing layer by layer the thick concrete flooring, packed soil, and rubble. A careful archaeology of the makeup of the urban ground. The island that remained in the middle of the excavation served as a reminder of that urban growth timeline. A soil profile of layers that were accumulated through various transformations of the building. The materials that were dug up were repurposed in order to build the installation's topography, and the finer soil were filled in the soil bags that replaced the former glass windows and turned the interior into a cave-like space. Also, construction materials have their own timelines, and the window planes were crushed in small pieces, returning the glass to what it once was, the grains of silica sand. With a plan outlined for creating a ruin, however, unexpected timelines were uncovered. The pieces of foundation of what used to be the former marble cutting facility, along with the pieces of marble. The ability to engage with this process and allowing for change and embracing whatever might be uncovered next becomes crucial when working with the ideas of degrowth. And it's not true only for physical artifacts, but also for memories, stories, and projections. Returning to the question of what timelines should be represented in this ruin folly, we decided to work not only with material realities that were already there, but also to include and reflect on elements that represented more distant pasts and futures, such as the wetlands that populated the Gulf during the last ice age, composed of UAE native plants, and an artificially built styrofoam meteorite with a lifespan by far exceeding hundreds of human generations. The script of language that were fire burned into the walls opened space for new imaginaries and interpretations. Degrowth is not antonym to growth or synonym to reduction. Through the process of making Nadi into a ruin folly, we learned that degrowth can be best expressed through transformation, taking away, adding, recycling, moving around, reinterpreting, projecting, repurposing available materials and resources into other ideas and timelines, using ideas of degrowth as a world-building tool. Degrowth modifies expected futures and alters performance makers. It evaluates success through other measures as long as we are willing to accept something other than growth for future. Thank you.
Sit in the middle.
Thank you both. We just have 10 minutes left, according to the ticker, so I'm going to jump straight into it. You know, we had this kind of rehearsal meeting where we had an amazing brainstorming session about their practice, and thank you, it was really well put and a lot condensed into this. And to me, the takeaway was something like an accelerated entropy. You kind of let a ruin accelerate into its degeneration as opposed to try and preserve the ruin. And this kind of helped me understand a little better what you mean by degrowth, at least in my interpretation of it, because the first instance is you imagine this to be a downscaling, but actually that's not what you're talking about. It's not about simply downscaling, which is considered a kind of solution to global scales and all of those kind of things, but rather actually thinking about this almost in the sense of decomposition or digestion or fermentation. So how would it be if we were to think of institution buildings as digestive processes or heritage projects as fermentation projects, you know? And in a way then what we're doing to heritage and ruins and things like that is kind of giving them a probiotic pill every day to kind of see what happens with this like accelerated digestion. And this is not just speaking metaphorically, because even a scholar and thinker that I think we all, the three of us, found very inspirational, Paul Preziado, who's one of the most like radical thinkers at the moment, thinking about really unmaking or undoing the legacy of institutions and the violence that they've kind of been built in with, is to separate memory from archives. That the archive is not necessarily a place where we have to keep retrieving history and memory, but rather a place where digestion and fermentation and these kind of things happen. Because memory is not just a kind of a USB stick, you just retrieve data. It actually comes with so many recognitions, all kinds of things. And that's what we're processing collectively as well as individually. So to come to questions, let me quickly ask you a couple, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Number one, how do you deal with accumulation? And I mean this because there's on the one hand an accumulation of value to structures, to heritage and things like that. And also on the other hand, which is symbolic, an accumulation of capital therefore. A lot of times this accumulation happens through primitive accumulation of capital, right? Long ages of accumulation. But also on the other hand, just the sheer material accumulation that comes with urban/architectural interventions that you make. You're creating archives, you're trying to retrieve memories, so you're creating a new accumulation of things. How does the Degrowth Institute deal with accumulation?
I mean, I think the same, as I was saying earlier in our presentation, right? There is this really oxymoronic moment where people are filling out these notebooks and then at the same time they're cutting it out. And I think this duality has like, it's not just us finding it in our work. For example, when people are towards the end of their life, they're still accumulating memories and they're accumulating experiences, but they know that their years are kind of coming to an end. So I think this kind of like, I basically think it would be a mistake to take accumulation out of the degrowth equation or the degrowth conversation. The same way we cannot take accumulation out of life. I think it's better for us to think of degrowth as transformation, but perhaps non-linear transformations, transformations that are just taking paths that are unexpected and uncontrolled in many ways. And I think this is also what is scary about ruins, right? That ruins are uncontrolled built environments. They do not have an architect, unless of course they're a folly. And I think it's this idea of control that we need to start embracing, or like rather losing control, when we think of degrowth.
I think it's, I just will very quickly add, it's also about where do you put that energy, because when we think about extraction, in fact, you could think about that as degrowth of certain resources. But then, you know, they're perhaps helping to create this accumulation and speeding up these extractive processes. And, you know, I think that we can shift those energies perhaps in different directions.
Thank you. Can you say a little bit about what made you choose the sites that you worked in? Because there are specific locations where you've done projects. There's Ukraine, there's Russian Far East, one of you is based in Thailand, you were in Athens, so, and then a project in Dubai. So what's about all of these places where you do your projects?
Sometimes places choose us.
Sorry?
Sometimes places choose us. I think that we started with very specific context, which was in the post-Soviet space, where you do have this reality of shrinking cities and kind of degrowth of the resources. And then when we started to develop the whole thinking about degrowth and what does it mean, we realized it also applies on many different levels on our personal life and also in contexts which we might not associate with degrowth, like Dubai, but with the climate emergencies and very extractive forces, I think it becomes inevitable that we'll have to think about shrinking futures in one way or another in all these like territories. But often I think one common denominator is like the landscapes where you really see the extraction forces that have shaped it and changed it and affected the livelihoods of people there.
And in some of the videos, one saw a group of people gathered in various sites. So who are the people that you're doing these projects with?
So normally with the Degrowth Institute, we always partner up with a local grassroots organization. We've been, for 6 years, we're based in Ukraine, where after Maidan in 2014, there's been an incredible urban emergence. I think the Maidan revolution kind of ignited a thought that people were perhaps in control of their territory, and it would be very common for us to be in meetings with a 17-year-old who has started an NGO for like street cats in his like small village, or yeah, I think this type of interests and how they're like weaved in was basically also guiding us to the different locations. So basically we were working with local partners and also just locals that were, yeah, that were from that specific city. And as our process went on, this kind of built also a network of practitioners, which is also quite exciting, of urban practitioners. A lot of them are still very active in this like very recent urban world in Ukraine.
And can you tell us a little bit about who are the people you worked with here in Dubai? Because I think that would be very curious to know, since you find partners, thinkers, practitioners. What was it like in Dubai to do this, and who all did you work with?
Right. So I think our project in Dubai was not so much about the Degrowth Institute. So it was more about building a commission from an art institution. We did partner up with a Ukrainian artist, graffiti artist and architect, Dana Kosmina, who was part of our project and was very relevant in terms of all the descriptions and work we did here. But I guess, yeah, I guess there were not particular working groups for this project here.
Yes, but I think that we did have a lot of discussions with All Circle team and with Vilma about thinking about, you know, undoing certain things, or, you know, taking apart a building which is a quiet bold step for an area that is actually developing like these buildings and warehouses and art spaces. Yes, but it's true that they were a little bit different in the collaboration nature.
Right, each site would produce. But I do suppose there would be a large force of people helping do everything you did, break down glass into sand, dig up places.
Yes, actually that was very interesting process, because we worked with people who constructed this building, and then
concrete building.
Concrete, where we are sitting, they built this building, and then we worked together to take apart the building. And I think it was very, very interesting process of like reverting that thinking, because neither people who have expertise to construct or planners, we don't work on a daily basis with the idea of taking down. And I think it can, this reverse process can, that's why it can generate a lot of different responses, I would say.
Got it. I'll have one more question and then I'm going to open it up, which is, given the point that was raised in the previous panel, which is, you know, that a lot of artists who work elsewhere or have gone from here to elsewhere, and then they come back and you measure impact based on what they've learned there and brought back. What has the project in Dubai done in everywhere else you're going? How has it made you think about your projects in maybe differently, or think about sites differently, think about locations differently? Any thoughts on that?
I think that this panel is very well framed case study. It really was a case study to not only to think about it as ideas or discuss it in a group of people, but really physically try to create or degrow building. And I think, of course, it's been very transformative in that way because, of course, certain things or processes you learn also as you go. It's very much a process-based work in that respect.
I think that building on that point, I think another thing that we brought out of Dubai was perhaps also like the bravery of an art institution to allow for something like this to happen, right? Like to demolish a building. It was very interesting coming to the side with Abdelmonem and his father, who had been so deeply connected to this site for a long time, and showing them like pieces of marble from the previous marble factory, and that allowance of relinquishing that form of control or like letting go. I think that was also quite interesting seeing that in practice. Yeah, being able to have that opportunity.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone.
Thank you, Sabih. Thank you.